Welcome to everyone. I will try to slowly start introducing this lecture and introduce Professor Mayhill Fowler, because our road to this lecture was followed by rain. Thank you for coming, and I hope more people will join us soon. But thank you to those who came here for the first time, and also to those who have been to previous lectures. For those of you who are here for the first time, I would like to inform you that the 4 weeks long program of lectures is dedicated to the issues of cultures, communities, milieus, and contested cities in the 20th century. And the title to this program is Jewish Days at the City Hall. It's the second program in a row. Last year we were talking here in this room about common heritage and about the questions on how to understand common heritage. Our third week starts with a lecture by Professor Mayhill Fowler. She is a professor from Stetson University in Florida, USA. The road of Mayhill Fowler to Lviv was quite interesting and saturated with events. Her first education is related to history and culture and language of Russia, and she got her first degree at Yale University. Later, she also got her master's degree in acting, in performing arts, and she has been an actor for quite a long time. That is why when Mayhill writes about theater, she takes both the perspective of the researcher and the person who has been inside this institution and this kind of art. The thesis after the period of acting was the coming back to the academic circles, and it is a good news for us. And this occurred in Princeton University, where she held her PhD thesis about theater in the Soviet Ukraine in the interwar period. And it is a pleasure for a colleague to announce that her dissertation, her thesis, is being prepared for print, and we do hope that next year we will have read the book about Beaumont on the verge of the empires and the stage and theater in Soviet Ukraine. The concept of the series of lectures and discussions is to combine the two topics that might seem to be on different shelves. Last week we were talking about violence taking place in the city. Tonight we shall talk about culture. Several researchers have already mentioned the fact that culture is the so-called thin layer that disappears and vanishes during the war in the first place. But also in times of violence and in times of conflict, many concepts, images and values are being articulated that have been circulated before the conflict. What is culture in the interwar Soviet Union? We shall now make a leap into another geography. We shall talk about Kharkiv and Kiev. But talking about these two cities, this lecture will also give us an opportunity to think about how to perceive and comprehend culture. Who are the actors of culture? What is the cultural process all about? How is it being transformed? How can it develop and shape the structure and images that have already vanished into thin air, for example, from the Soviet Ukraine, but they keep producing their impact on our thinking and our perception of the world, and also on the expectations from the culture that we have. At least two levels will be mentioned about Kharkiv and Kyiv, but also about what culture is all about. And Professor Mayhill Fowler will talk about these topics tonight, and I would pass the floor to her. But before that, I would like to remind you that the lecture will be in English, even though Professor Fowler is absolutely fluent in Ukrainian. That is why if you feel like asking a question in Ukrainian, you're welcome, or any language you like. You can use these headsets for your convenience to listen to interpreting into Ukrainian. It's important to ask your questions into the microphone, but that would happen after some 45 minutes.
So first of all, thank you so much to everyone for being here, for coming out in the rain to hear about Yiddish theater in Soviet Ukraine. I want to thank everyone at the Center for Urban History, Sofia Diak, Ira Matzavko, Mariana Mazurak, for organizing this and making this event happen. So I want to start with a few warnings about the scope of this talk. I want to manage your expectations. I'm not an expert on Galicia. As Sophia said, my book, which is coming out with University of Toronto Press next year, my editor always tells me to advertise it, so I'm advertising it. It's on Soviet Ukrainian theater in the 20s and 30s, so that means it's on what's today Central and Eastern Ukraine. It's not on Galicia. I'm also not a specialist in Jewish history. I started studying Yiddish theater because as I was studying Ukrainian-language theater, I found so many materials in Yiddish and so much on Yiddish theater that it seemed imperative to at least try to basically learn the language and learn something about Yiddish theater. And I think that it's actually partially thanks to studying Yiddish theater that my dissertation and now book became more about theater in Soviet Ukraine versus Ukrainian theater, and that makes sense. This is also not a talk about the facts and figures of Yiddish theater in Soviet Ukraine. I'm not going to take you on a walk through productions and actors. If you're interested, I'm happy to give you material. I can point you to the articles of Alexandra Podoprigorova or Irina Maleshkina or me. But my point is actually not aesthetic analysis tonight. I really wanted to raise some more conceptual questions that I think relate to this series. And conceptually, I'm really interested in this basic concept of ethnic theater in a multi-ethnic place, which sounds simple, but it's actually very complex. What are the relationships between these different milieus of Yiddish-language theater artists, Ukrainian-language theater artists, Russian-language theater artists? What is the relationship between these milieus and the state? And what is the relationship between these different milieus and their larger audience? I think these are really important questions, and they raise kind of these even more large questions of what is national theater at all? What is Yiddish theater? What is Ukrainian theater? What is American theater, right? Is it just language? Is it a certain series of texts? Is it a canon? Is it practices? Is it the way we use our hands? I use my hands too much when I speak. Is it the ethnicity of the artists? Is it who's sitting in the audience? These are all really important questions that particularly in the period that I'm talking about tonight, artists and officials were obsessed with, right? What makes our theater belong to our community, and what are the boundaries of our community, right? So these are really important questions. The 1920s were years of flourishing for non-Russian language theater in the Soviet Union. And in particular, the decade witnessed the explosion of experimentation in theater in Yiddish and in Ukrainian. That's what I'm talking about tonight. And the artists working in this decade have become, for some, household names, right? we can think of Mark Chagall, Solomon Michoels, David Bergelson, or Les Kurbas, Ostap Vishnya, Mykola Kulish, right? These are all artists still discussed, debated, commemorated today. Yet one block of Prorozhna Street in Kyiv, specifically the block between today Volodymyrska and Pushkinska, raises or offers a window on this conceptual problem that I've just outlined. So in the years of the Civil War, particularly 1919, this one city block on one side of the street held experimental theater studios in 3 languages, in Yiddish, in Ukrainian, and in Polish. So the theater studio of the Yiddish-language Kulturliga, Culture League, worked with rising literary figures like David Bergelson. The Young Theater, or Molody Theatre, under Les Kurbas, led efforts to bring the European-inspired avant-garde to Ukrainian-language theater. Stanisława Wysocka worked with young actors who would actually transform Polish theater in the interwar Polish state. And these theater studios are prominently featured in national theater histories, right? What would Yiddish theater be without the Culture League? What would Ukrainian-language theater be without Kurbas and the Molody? What would Polish theater in the interwar period be without Stanisława Wysocka? So if you took out of the library kind of a book on Yiddish theater or Ukrainian theater or Polish theater, you'd find the stories of these studios. Yet all of these experiments happened in the very same block of the very same street. And moreover, Wysocka taught at the Culture League studio. So she taught at the Yiddish-language theater studio. She was joined by Androsy Buchma, who was a rising star in the Ukrainian-language theater. She was also joined by Shimon Goldstein, who I'll talk about later. His other names were Semyon Semdor or Semyon Doroshenko, who was a Jewish actor primarily working in Ukrainian-language theater. So these young artists are sort of working in each other's theater studios. And they all belonged to a particular artistic generation. They were interested in the same kinds of things artistically, exploring physicality in acting, working with interesting new set designs and using the sets in very different ways, interested in new repertory. And whether they called it shund in Yiddish or pogotovi in Ukrainian, young artists in these studios wanted to bring their theater from the realistic, everyday, to a new theatrical experimentation. So in other words, their work looks similar. You look at pictures of their work, it looks very similar. So what does this mean? I'm interested in this messy reality of Prorozhna Street. I'm interested in the web that existed within ethnic theaters in a multi-ethnic place, and specifically between Yiddish-language and Ukrainian-language theater. How do we explain the emergence of ethnic cultures in a multi-ethnic place? How did hybridity or cultural exchange play a role in the relationship between milieus of artists working in Ukrainian and artists working in Yiddish? And I'm going to suggest one approach to approaching this problem, which is a look backstage. So not looking at the aesthetic production on stage, but actually going behind the scenes. A micro-level approach, tracking the biographies of individual arts managers and artists and arts officials to capture this world backstage and this paradox of similarity and difference between these different non-Russian language theater milieus. Ultimately, the big takeaway for this talk is that I'm suggesting the presence of specifically Yiddish and Ukrainian theater shaped a regional culture of Soviet Ukraine itself. And ultimately, I'm suggesting the importance of local perspectives in the analysis of the Stalinist arts. That's the big takeaway. You could leave now, but I'm glad you don't. Okay. So let's unpack this conceptual problem. Why is Prorozhna Street a problem? So there are 2 reasons. One is ethnicity, and 2 is the theater itself. So ethnicity. So there's a difficulty in articulating the relationship between Ukrainian language theater and Yiddish language theater because at this point in the 1920s, the artists themselves were reevaluating what these theaters were, right? These are not stable concepts. This is after World War I, this is after the Revolution and Civil War, right? The advent of modernity. And artists are really rethinking what is our theater, right? These concepts are under transformation and redefinition. And so there's a lot of work on kind of the aesthetic history of Ukrainian language or Yiddish language theater, which is really important because they've often been overlooked in general surveys. But I think a lot of that work misses the very contingency of these categories and the fact that they were under redefinition at the time. Culture is always constructed, and particularly at this time, these categories of Yiddish language theater or theater in Ukrainian were under massive negotiation, contestation, and construction. And actually, as most people here know very well, ethnicity and nationality itself was under redefinition in the early Soviet period, right? Soviet Ukrainian elites, according to proper Soviet nationality policy, hierarchized the arts according to policies of Kyrgyzization, indigenization, with, in Soviet Ukraine, Ukrainian as the titular ethnos of the republic, and Russian, Yiddish, and Polish in that order, each culture receiving less financial support and less access to scarce resources. So in other words, officials and artists are using this concept of a hierarchy of nationality, a very strict template, and they're putting that on a population and a set of artists that are actually very messy and complicated, right? Which pose certain problems. Also, there's, to say Yiddish language theater or Ukrainian language theater actually really isn't correct. There was never one Yiddish language theater or Ukrainian language theater. And in fact, again, particularly at this time, in a post-war, post-revolution period with scarce resources, the tension between different troops in Yiddish and different troops in Ukrainian was quite tense. There were many Yiddish language troops in Soviet Ukraine. I will briefly sketch this landscape for you just so you know. There were two major state-supported troops. One was in Kharkiv and one was in Kyiv, both coming from the basis of earlier troops. There was also a troop in Odessa. There were also itinerant troops serving smaller towns outside the major cities. And there was for a while a musical comedy theater that didn't last very long, but it did exist. Even after the Soviet state really consolidated Yiddish language theater in 1934, there was still a major state-supported troop in Kiev, which was the capital. After 1934, there was a troop in Odessa. There were two itinerant troops. There was the only Yiddish language theater of young spectators in Kiev. So I could go into more detail, but this is just to give you this idea of, this is a very complicated landscape, right? Each theater is different, each troupe is different, right? So to even just say Yiddish language theater is a little, that category was quite capacious. And for anyone who knows anything about Ukrainian language theater, of course, sorry, I'm speaking fast. Ukrainian language theater as well was a very tense landscape. So again, ethnicity poses a problem when we analyze the relationship between different theaters because the theaters themselves were under contestation. So the second challenge is actually theater. And I will just say that theater was not ever an ethnically particular place. And I'm sorry if that's disappointing, but it's true. The text, if you think about it, is funded by patrons, performed by actors, experienced by audiences, and supported by various technical personnel, musicians, designers, ticket takers, people working the buffet in the lobby. These various spaces had people of various ethnicities, and theater was never actually a mono-ethnic cultural product. For example, in 1931, the composition of the State Polish Theater in Soviet Ukraine included 24 Poles, 11 Jews, 13 Ukrainians, 2 Russians, and 1 Belarusian. The majority of the Berezil Theater, many of you know, the centerpiece Ukrainian language theater in Soviet Ukraine, was a majority ethnically Ukrainian, that's for sure. but the entire institution was not. So there were 142 people on permanent salary at the Berezil. 52 worked as actors, 17 as members of the orchestra, and 61 worked in administrative or technical positions. Of these 142 in the Berezil on permanent salary, the nationality divide was as follows: 100 Ukrainians, 23 Russians, 13 Jews, 2 Poles, 2 Germans, 1 Czech, and 1 Uzbek. And I don't have the same numbers for the Yiddish language theaters, but my sense from other documents is that it's similar. In other words, it's a majority Jews in artistic positions as actors, but once you move beyond the artistic personnel, you see a much more multi-ethnic group. And this is not to say that certain agents, whether they're funders, local supporters, playwrights, intelligentsia, members of the audience, they might have perceived their theater as part of a national project, right? But the reality was actually messier. So we've got these two problems of ethnicity and theater itself, and let me take you backstage a little bit to show you how theater worked in the Soviet Union. Okay, so let's start with arts officials. If you've got a state monopoly on the arts, you're going to have a lot of people working in the state managing that monopoly. Okay, you have people whose job it is every day to hire and fire artists, to deal with repertory, to allocate budgets, to wrangle issues with various artistic personnel, etc. And of course, arts officials had to deal with a multi-ethnic state. In one season, for example, the Commissariat of Enlightenment, Narkompros in Russian, Narkomos in Ukrainian, had to read plays in Ukrainian, 286 scripts, Russian, 205, Yiddish, 80, and a group of 19 scripts in Armenian, Polish, and German, and decide on suitability for performance. So again, if you were working in the Commissariat of Enlightenment, you might on one day have across your desk a Ukrainian, a Russian, a Yiddish, an Armenian, a Polish, and a German play script that you would then have to evaluate for production. The head of the arts division in the 1920s, Mykola Hristovi, dealt with the multi-ethnic landscape on an everyday basis, and never according to mono-ethnic categorization. He writes a lot of memos where he sort of delegates to his underlings where people should move. In other words, moving people from one theater to another. And it's never based on ethnicity. So it's such and such is a very talented director. We're lacking young directors at this theater. Let's move him over. So-and-so is really good with money. This theater's not doing well financially. Let's move this guy over here. So-and-so is doing really well in the technical staff. Let's move him over here. So he's playing this game of chess, right? Moving all these generally technical personnel around, not by what ethnicity they are, but by how are their talents best served, so I can create an efficient product that fulfills the plan, right? That's the overarching goal for people like Hristovi and arts officials. You can look also at theater managers. So at that sort of this level of officials in the state, there's also this story of the actual people managing the theater, right? Who have to make sure that the production runs on time, that they fulfill the plan, that they show up and perform when they're supposed to show up and perform. Moise Levitan is the theater manager in the 1920s for the Kharkiv-based Yiddish theater. Looking at his memos that he writes to the Commissariat of Enlightenment are very revealing. So he has to write in all the time about how his theater's doing, right? How are they doing in different touring stops? How are they performing? So he writes in 1927 that they're doing great. They go to Berdichev, which is a largely Jewish city. They perform their signature Purim spiel. It's great. Everyone loves them. Then they go to Vinnytsia, And they get very little audience in Venezia. And he's got to explain that. And how does he do that? Well, he says, actually, it's really good for us that we didn't get an audience in Venezia. Venezia, Levitan says, is not industrial. It still is shaped by the traditions of meszczanstwa, petty bourgeoisie. And Levitan says, actually, that we didn't get an audience only shows what a great proletarian theater we are, right? So it shows he's got to sort of maneuver, right, to make this palatable to his superiors. Levitan also has great hopes for Odessa. And in fact, one of the theater manager's job in the Soviet state was organizing audiences. People rarely just bought individual theater tickets. You had to have a manager work with party leaders, union leaders, factory leaders to buy chunks of seats for a performance. That really showed the success of a production. And so Levitan has sold a lot of shows in Odessa, right? So he's really pleased when they go to Odessa, it's going to be great. Of course, it was not. Everything went wrong. And it went wrong in a very Soviet way, right? He experiences a problem that a lot of Soviet theaters experienced, which is the following. It's great to say that the theater is fully state-supported, but what does that actually mean? And in fact, what it meant was theaters had to get pots of money from a bunch of different sources to be able to fund their existence. In this case, the theater was on tour in Odessa and had made an agreement that they were going to get a certain amount of money from the city to pay for the tour. And of course, they show up in Odessa, they don't get all the money. Also, the theater they were performing in needed a lot of renovation. The props were old, the sets were old. The actors had to use their own money to make sure that their props and costumes and sets were ready for performance. And what got cut? Their salaries, right? So the artists are getting no salaries, and 7 of the leading actors threatened to leave, right? So Levitan at this point is writing all these telegrams. It's fine, you're hearing this stuff, but it's fine, don't worry, everything's gonna be fine. The tour worked out okay, but in February 1928, Levitan had to explain all of this to a big Soviet-Ukrainian meeting of all theater managers. So he's sitting with theater managers from the Ukrainian theater, from the Berezil, Ivan Franko, and has to explain why they bombed, right? And he gets grilled by his colleagues. How much did you spend on taxes? Why didn't you organize this earlier? Why did star actress Leah Bubova leave? Was it on the part of the direction? So he gets grilled by his colleagues and has to explain why things went wrong. And it's very stressful because he's negotiating for resources in a society of scarcity where there isn't enough for each theater, right? So he's competing with everyone at this meeting. And in fact, Levitan is subject to just as much risk as artists. He was arrested in 1937 and sent to the Gulag, and his archival trail ends there. So less important than whether this theater was in Yiddish or Ukrainian or Russian, the fact was that it was Soviet theater, right? And that ultimately was the important category for him in his life story. And I need to say that the onstage story of this Kharkiv State Yiddish Theater would look quite different, right? Their artistic director, Ephraim Leuter, had worked with Milieus, would actually leave Soviet Ukraine to continue working with Milieus. He was hired as the head teacher at the studio school of Milieus Gassiet in Moscow. Actress Leah Bubova, who actually threatened to leave in Odessa, came back after her salary dispute, starred as the leading actress of this theater, continued to work with Leuter, and actually became a very famous actress of Soviet Ukraine. Reviews of these productions, photographs of these productions suggest that this was a great theater. If we just looked at the productions on stage, we would see the development of modern Yiddish theater happening in the Soviet Union. But if we look backstage, we see this very Soviet story of anxiety, stress, and a lack of resources. Administrators had their careers and their lives on the line, whether they were operating in Yiddish or Ukrainian or Russian. And a look backstage also shows how this interesting theater administrative staff was very much its own milieu, actually. They all knew each other, and they all negotiate with each other. So the next managing director of the Yiddish theater asks the Ukrainian-language theater for a dormitory bed, right? He doesn't have housing yet. Theaters negotiate on a personal level for summer tours, in other words, renting out their theater to another theater to make money over the summer. When the Holodomor happens in 32, 33, this sort of milieu of theater administrators becomes very important because they organize access to cafeterias and production bases. And in fact, the managing director of the opera gets in a lot of trouble in Kharkiv because he allows family members of artists and officials at the opera to use that cafeteria. And the union level arts workers union cracks down and says, you know, you've got to let the other artists use the cafeteria first. Family members have to wait. So, in other words, this sort of world of theater administrators is really part of the same world and not separated by ethnicity. And importantly, I want to say that this sort of single backstage world, I mean, that's really what I'm saying, doesn't mean that there's nothing meaningful about Yiddish theater itself, right? Both Yiddish-language and Ukrainian-language theater, however, experience the process of Sovietization in a very similar way, right, with similar results. And importantly, we can use comparison to see how similar those two cases are. And my comparison here is the Polish language theater in Soviet Ukraine, which had a very different experience with the Soviet state and Soviet society than the Yiddish or Ukrainian language theater. Kiev actually had the only state Polish theater in the entire Soviet Union. It was founded in 1926 on the basis of a workers' theater, but the institution was largely a disaster. And this was because Stanisława Wysocka, whom I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and any Polish artists left for Poland, right? It was the rare Polish artist who stayed in the Soviet Union and didn't go to, you know, the new Polish state. And in fact, the state looks for a really long time to try to find an artistic director. They ask one guy in St. Petersburg, and he says he hasn't spoken Polish since 1915. So they finally hire revolutionary theater artist Witold Wandorski, who has a lot of chops because he spent time in jail in interwar Poland, and he's a communist. So they hire him, he comes to Kiev, he takes up work, and he's appalled. He says students speak Polish badly, they're basically bourgeois and foreign to revolutionary ideology, and far from grasping the foundations of Soviet society. And he's really upset that he watches a play, and they show him a play that they've been working on. And they perform it outside Kiev. It seems to a Polish-speaking audience. It's an agitprop play about the Polish Bolshevik War. So the good guys are supposed to be the Bolsheviks, the bad guys are the Poles, right? And they perform it so badly that the audience says, "Thank you so much for showing us an example of how silly the Bolsheviks are and how great the Polish military is." So they just flipped it. So Wandorski sends the Commissariat of Enlightenment my favorite telegram. This is probably my favorite document. "The situation of the Polish theater is altogether serious. Stop. No space. Stop. No budget. Stop. No managing director. Stop. No cadres. Stop. Please come personally." They do come personally, and of course they don't blame the institution, they blame Wandorski. He's arrested, sent to Moscow, and executed in 1931. And in 1931, the Soviet Ukrainian state actually petitions the Kremlin to fund the theater. They say, you know, okay, we had this mistake with this guy Wandursky, but we have the only state Polish theater in the Union. Could you guys fund it? And they say no. The theater's in Kiev. It's on your budget. In 1938, Khrushchev's Soviet Ukrainian Politburo liquidates the theater. It's a tough time for Poles in the Soviet Union at this time. There's an anti-Polish campaign. There's the Great Terror. There are all these reasons, political reasons, for the failure of the theater. There are also some other reasons. The actors themselves say that they lack the culture of the word, since 45% of the troupe was not Polish and actually didn't speak Polish fluently. Artists complained that it was painful to perform to near empty houses, and they want the theater to be liquidated so they can get placed in different companies. And I think the failure of the Polish theater really highlights the relative success of the Yiddish and Ukrainian language theaters. They never would have been shut down for lack of spectators or lack of language, lack of political will. And in fact, the presence of administrators like Moise Levitan, artists like Ephraim Leuter, the administrating shuffling of Christa V in the archival documents attest to the crucial place of Yiddish theater in Soviet Ukraine. So put differently, one of the distinguishing features of the Soviet Ukrainian theatrical landscape is precisely the great quantity of Yiddish theater. Osip Mandelstam, visiting Kiev in 1926, makes a connection between Solomon Michoels and Gassiet, the Moscow State Yiddish Theater, and Les Kurbas and the Berezil. And he says, you know, both of them are non-Russian minorities. They're both trying to bring high culture in these non-Russian languages. But I think Mandelstam actually misses a profound difference between these two theaters. Michoels Gassiet was the only such theater of Union significance in Moscow, and he rides this wave of high culture all the way to the Kremlin. Kurbas is far from the Kremlin, making theater in the Soviet provinces, and in a much more multi-ethnic landscape. In other words, Michoels is niche, Kurbas is mainstream. And Mandelstam also misses the point that there's many Yiddish theaters in Soviet Ukraine. It's in fact one of the distinguishing features of the Soviet Ukrainian arts scene. And Yiddish theater is often associated exclusively or primarily with Michoels, which really occludes the reality that the majority of Jews live not in Moscow but in the former Pale of Settlement. Michoels theater was an exception. It is the only non-Russian language theater, Союзного подчинения, so the only non-Russian language theater funded and managed at the Union level. It's a boutique theater in Moscow and had to fulfill a niche role. But Yiddish language theater constituted a much more significant part of the theatrical landscape in Soviet Ukraine. Many of the Soviet Yiddish theater playwrights and actors came from the region. In fact, there's this legend of Gassiet tours Soviet Ukraine, and on the way they sort of scoop up a bunch of talented artists and take them back to Moscow. Different playwrights, Lee Bereznik, Isaac Guberman, Perez Markish, all come from Soviet Ukraine. The view Backstage also illuminates the world of actors working in this space. Because Soviet theater was categorized by ethnicity, there are indeed actors whose careers unfold in theater of one ethnicity, but their backstage world was much more complicated. And I'm looking at memoirs of actors to throw a lens on this complex web. There's an account by an actor, Albert Stolsky, that shows, I think, how rich and varied the world of Yiddish theater was in Soviet Ukraine. And I'm just going to read aloud the list of troupes that he works in after the revolution. So again, this is a list that's going to get consolidated in the 1920s, of course, but I think it speaks to how much Yiddish theater there was in the region. So this is where he works after 1917. The Lipsk Andronov Theater, another troupe performing in a cinema in Podil, with a group of actors renting space in another cinema. The Fish Song Collective, starring Vera Zaslavska, a Yiddish operetta theater. The Kunstwinkel, starring Lazar Kamelnovich with 60 actors. the troupe of Albert Segalesko and his second wife, Rosa Brin, who came to Kiev in 1922. Leah Bukova, interestingly, starred in this troupe, and they performed everything from Leonid Andreev to an operetta called Mishmash to Talia. Stolsky continues to work with troupes in Vinnytsia, Odessa, Nemirov, Proskurev, rejoins Segalesko for a wide repertoire, and eventually joins the operetta troupe of Clara Young in Kiev. This is all before 1934, before the party kind of organizes and consolidates troops. He ends up at the itinerant Shalom Aleichem Yiddish Theater based in Zhytomyr. With that theater, he's evacuated to Central Asia in World War II, and he ends his career in this city, in Lviv, as an arts administrator. So Vinnytsia, Nemirov, Proskurev, Zhytomyr, Kiev, right? The sheer number of troops and plays and artists mentioned in Stolsky's short account speaks to the prevalence of Yiddish theater in Soviet Ukraine. Or let's look at Dmitry Zhabotinsky. Born in the end of the Russian Empire in the shtetl of Zhabotin in Cherkasy region, his first memory was the sound of Ukrainian girls singing. His family moves to Cherkasy itself, where he begins studying with a cantor. He was invited to perform with a provincial Russian language troupe, and from that point he saw everything possible in late imperial Cherkasy. The Yiddish language troupe of Moise Genfer, where he saw David's Fiddler with Kalmanovich, Robert Adelheim starred the Russian stage in Gutzkov's Uriel Acosta, and an itinerant musician called Baruch der Klezmer. Zhabotinsky began his professional career in the Russian theater with a local impresario, then performed with a coupletin artist named Zinkrautal, then moved officially to the Yiddish language theater in 1917. First the Kunstwinkel in Kiev, then the Kiev State Yiddish Theater. He never went to Moscow to study with Gassiet, although he was offered to do so. He always stayed local. He ended up, after the liquidation of the Yiddish theater in 1950, he ended up at the Lesia Ukrainka Russian language theater in Kiev, where he ends his career. So these two actors, Zhabotinsky and Stolsky, may have started in lower level troops, they may not have worked at Gassiet, but they had very rich and varied careers in the Yiddish theater that attest to the variety of Yiddish theater in Soviet Ukraine. And their careers unfolded primarily in the Yiddish theater, but clearly their ability to negotiate the theatrical landscape refixes a perspective on their careers. They're multilingual actors operating in a multilingual space and handily able to shift theaters. There are other actors who shifted as well. Miriam Lifshitz and Henryk Tarlow moved from the Yiddish to the Polish theater, together with Boris Drabinsky, who moved from the Ukrainian language theater to the Polish theater. Semyon Goldstein Doroshenko Semdor, whom I've mentioned before, shift from many companies, performing in chronologically Russian, Yiddish, Ukrainian, Yiddish, and Ukrainian until he died of sunstroke in Crimea. So for artists who grew up in a multi-ethnic and multilinguistic world, the borders of a particular ethnic theater could prove fluid. More important to artists seems to have been a consistent salary, consistent work, and more important to administrators staffing a full troupe able to provide the performances required by production plans. The language changed, but little else. The trappings of a Soviet arts career remained the same. The wall newspaper, the State Gazeta, the state-funded apartment, the tours, the repertory, and in some cases, the audience. So if we talk about the space backstage, we have to talk about the audience. It's very difficult in the Stalinist period, and perhaps at all, to really find out who the audience was and how they experienced a particular theatrical production. We do know, however, that people went to the Yiddish theater, and I say that not only because of the potentially fake attendance numbers, but also because if they hadn't been going, the theater would have been closed, as the Polish theater was. And yet, Solomon Mikhoil's theater was struggling in the 1930s in Moscow. There's a fascinating Arts Workers Union meeting in late '33 where the leaders of all of the Republic Yiddish theaters meet, and Mikhoils gives a speech, and he talks about how they're not getting enough attendance, and he says the problem is the theory of denationalization, assimilation, that there's this progressive growth of the cultural level of the Jewish working masses, who lived not only through interest in Soviet Jewish culture, but also in other cultures of the peoples of the USSR. Right? So he's talking about the fact that if people could go to other theaters, they were going to other theaters, right? And indeed, that seems to be true, that audiences, in many cases, stopped being separated ethnically and began to attend the sort of supra-ethnic Soviet theater, as opposed to more niche ethnic theater. This was less true, I should say, in Soviet Ukraine simply because of demography, right? Kiev was 1/3 Jewish before 1941. But still, the theaters experienced this denationalization. And in a way, we might think about how it's sort of inevitable that with Sovietization would come homogenization, right? With centralization of the apparat and these decisions and management, there's this sort of standardization that might inevitably follow. National in form and socialist in content might need homogenization as well. The repertory of the Yiddish language and Ukrainian language theaters followed a similar trajectory. And here I'm talking about the Backstage, Ukrainian language theater, and the Kharkiv state, and then, which becomes the Kiev state, Yiddish language theater. So in the early Soviet years, each theater does experimental plays on classic themes. So Yiddish theater does Purim Spiel, Purim, Jewish holiday. They also do a play called In Plan, which is a play about the pogroms of the Civil War. The Berezio does Kurbas's production of Haidamaki. So in Bren, about pogroms, Civil War, Haidamaki, ethnic tension several centuries earlier, but sort of comparable ethnic choices. Each theater incorporates contemporary writers from the West. The Yiddish theater incorporates Jack London's In the Golden Land, in Der Goldene Medina, and the Berezil does a famous production of Upton Sinclair's Jimmy Higgins. Each also does a popular comic review based on Soviet themes. Hello from Radio Wave 477 at the Berezil, and The Chimney Sweep at the Yiddish language theater. Of course, they do productions by Soviet Ukrainian playwrights, Leonid Pieromaisky, Ivan Dniprovsky, and revisit 19th century classics, whether Goldfaden or Kropotnitsky. But as the theaters creep towards the late 1930s, their repertories look really, really similar and homogenized. The Berezil does Sholem Aleichem, the Yiddish theater does Shakespeare. At one point in the late 1930s, the Kiev Yiddish Theater for Children does Moishe Pinchevsky's El Dorado, Motel the Kantor's Son, Sholem Aleichem, Don Quixote, and Puss in Boots, which is the perfect mix of ethnic, contemporary, classic, and universal. And in fact, if you look at repertories of theaters across the Union, you see the same thing, right? You see everyone's doing Gornichuk, right? The Soviet Ukrainian playwright. Everyone does their own ethnic play, and everything else really starts to look similar. So you have this real story of homogenization happening. And I think ultimately, the stories of these individuals, these artists, these arts managers, these officials, speak to the power of the region as an organizational category. So I think the more fruitful question is actually not to what extent encounter with Ukrainians and Jews shaped each other's theater, but how both contributed to making something called Soviet Ukrainian culture. So the operative category might not be Yiddish or Ukrainian, but rather the region. And this particular region was rich in Yiddish and Ukrainian language theater, and was a region far from Moscow. So assessing the world backstage suggests the mercurial way that ethnicity shaped Soviet theater. Ethnic categorization was primary, to be sure. I'm not arguing it's not. But at the same time, artists and officials were in the process of actually redefining those ethnic categories. And in this way, I think examining the multi-ethnic borderlands offers a crucial contribution to the study of Stalinist culture. Because the borderlands reveal not a dichotomy, in other words, not Russian versus Ukrainian, not Russian versus Yiddish, but actually this very interesting story of homogenization of multiple ethnic cultures in one place. A close examination of the multi-ethnic theaters on the borderlands might not show to what degree cultural exchange existed, but it does suggest the importance of place as an analytic category. In other words, officials and artists, as their biographies show, may have aimed for ethno-national separation of theater, but they did not necessarily experience theater that way. And I think there's a way that we should be very careful about not taking their categories of analysis as our assumed categories of analysis. Backstage at the Yiddish theater may have been backstage at the Ukrainian theater, so these may have been the same backstage places, at least in Soviet Ukraine. So I hope that I've managed to sketch out a little bit about the conceptual problem of ethnic culture in a multi-ethnic place. And I hope that I've set us up well for our further lectures about culture in a very specific multi-ethnic place of Lviv. I think it's really great that we're moving from violence to culture. Culture can be a place of violence, right? But culture is also a place where we negotiate and respond to violence, and I think is equally as important. So again, apologize for speaking fast, and I hope you were able to understand something, and any questions are much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking us into this dense and intense and rich world, for understanding the period. We read a little bit, heard a little bit, but also for sharing so many insights for us into going to any cultural institution as audience or as whatever role we have. Now I'm happy to open the floor for questions and comments. Oh, we have one. So please tell your name and let us know about your question. Here is a mic, and I will, yeah, it's working, and then I will assist with the second one for the second question.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. That was great. I have just a couple questions, and you can answer either or neither or both. Or add what you want. The whole idea of borderlands, this idea of overcoming national categories that started, I guess, with Tana Zara and that whole class of people. I mean, it's so important, but it raises all these questions to me. I'll just ask you a couple of them. The first one is multilingualism. So how common was that? I mean, with these actors and stagehands, actually, even more interestingly, was that uncommon that they could speak these languages? And what does that say about their identity? I gather the statistics are because the Soviets forced choices of national affiliation, but that's obviously a very new creation. And if you have a Jew who's speaking fluent Ukrainian and it's totally secular, it makes an interesting question. And also the audience, who's going to the plays? Now I understand that Jews can increasingly go to a Russian or a Ukrainian play, but can the non-Jews, are they going to the Yiddish plays, the audience, and are they going to get the content if it's a Purim spiel? Or if it's in Yiddish for that matter. And that's the second question, is the issue of content, how that's being affected by this multiculturalism. And then finally, a small question, after 1930, when the state turned against Yiddish culture and Yiddish theater, so did it turn against the Ukrainian theater as well? What happened to these actors? Did they all die during the purges at the same time, if they died at all? So
they all die at different times. So thank you so much for your comments. Borderlands, yes. Overcoming national categories, yeah, raises so many questions. I think it's very complex. There's a memoir by Yuri Smolich, who becomes a famous Soviet Ukrainian writer, and he talks about growing up in Uman and how really what he's saying is the operative category wasn't whether we were Ukrainian or Jewish, but like whether we were cool young people or not. And he speaks Yiddish, I don't know whether he reads it, but he speaks it just from playing with his friends. And a lot of people again, perhaps not in Kiev, but in small towns, knew more of these languages than you would think, right? Just from basic communication. And this concept of the Soviets forcing choices, I think, is really important. Johanna Petrovsky-Stern has a book on the Soviet Ukrainian Jew. And I think it's very interesting because he still uses this category of, you know, it was amazing that they were Jewish, but they chose to write in Ukrainian. So why couldn't the category of Soviet Ukrainian have just included Jews, right? But it couldn't somehow. So even if you were Jewish and you chose to write in Ukrainian, you were still Jewish, right? But I think it's a time where these categories do become confused, right? And there is that tension between wanting to build, in this case, Ukrainian language culture, but also wanting to be a part of the Socialist International, right? And those things are sometimes at odds. And the content, yeah, I mean, the content starts very exclusive to, depending on which theater you're talking about, to a Yiddish language community, right? In Bren, about pogroms, right? Rosa the Rabbi's Daughter, about Rosa the Rabbi's daughter, right? You know, Sholem Aleichem, right? But as you move to the 1930s, it becomes very removed from that, right? And they're doing the same plays that you would find in another theater, just in Yiddish. I think the question of the audience is a huge question, and we just don't know. We really don't know. There's one report I told the students about, actually, where the Commissariat of Enlightenment interviews audience members who see an Isaac Babel play at both the Ukrainian and Russian language theater in Odessa. And they laugh at it because the actor playing a cantor at one point can't speak Hebrew. And they're just like, oh my God, it was so funny because he couldn't speak Hebrew. So you sort of understand from that this was a Jewish audience, these weren't actors who knew Hebrew, right? But we don't really know. The state still supports Ukrainian and Yiddish language theater well through the 1930s with no problem, well, with problems, but still supports. The Yiddish theater, Milieus is murdered in '48, and so by 50, Yiddish theaters are shut down across the Soviet Union. And with Ukrainian language theater, it's difficult. There was this really amazing moment in the late 20s and early 30s where you had this modernist, experimental, pushing the boundaries, theatrical culture, and it really ends when its leaders are arrested and shot in the 30s. Yes, so that answers your question. Thank you.
Тут є питання і ще є. Ні, тут було перше, потім Оксана, потім Богдан.
Thank you for such a great lecture. And my English is not so fluent, but I try my best to...
Може українською, якщо?
Я може спробую все-таки...
Добре.
To try my English, because I don't practice English. My interest is about Les Kurbas. You were speaking about his performing in Kharkiv, and my interest is about his mother, Manda Yanovacheva, known as Yanovacheva, but her name was Wanda Teichner or Teichner. And in early registration books, she wrote that she was Greco-Catholic, and but she was the daughter of Adolf Teichner. And my question is, maybe somewhere you have seen that she was a Jewish girl, but not a Ukrainian girl. Because now we are thinking that Les Kurbas is not totally Ukrainian actor, because maybe his mother was Jewish, you know? And this is a theme what I'm thinking about now. We have a lot of arguments for such idea, because the situation is that she married Ukrainian actor Stepan Kurbas, and he was a maybe she changed her, how it would be, her nationality for her husband. And that will be a great provocation, you know, and maybe you see something in any documents if there was such an information, but because she was playing in Brazil in 20s and 30s, you know, maybe you will say something about that. Thank you.
Sure. So actually, I think your question points to some very important issues. I haven't seen anything that Kurbas's mother was Jewish. In a way, who cares? And in a way, why does that mean he's not? Again, how funny is it that we're using these very 19th century ethnic categories to say whether he's, you know, Ukrainian, and then what does that make his theater? His theater was awesome, right? And who knows about her ethnicity? I really don't know. She, I really don't know. I always thought she was Ukrainian, but who knows? What I will say is that, you know, he grew up in a tiny little town, living with his grandfather. He actually knew Yiddish. His first play was directing the Yiddish kids in the town in a production of Aida, which I can't imagine must have been very good. And he actually, at one point in 1920, I think, does a Yiddish translation of Macbeth and performs that at Bielitz in Bielitz outside Kiev. But I don't, I think to be obsessed with the ethnicity of his mother is maybe missing the larger point that, again, even though he was trying to make theater in Ukrainian, he was trying to make international theater, right? He was trying to make theater on the world stage. And I think, you know, whether his mother was Jewish or not, it didn't really make a difference to him.
I could actually recommend the book about the life of Les Kurbas, and
I think that, you know,
there are answers to your questions. Maybe there might be answers to your questions
and,
there.
you know, find, you know, about Kurbas, how he is displayed in different Wikipedias. Maybe sometimes it's an interesting exercise. Oksana, before Bogdan Shumolodja, I'm looking for your hands.
Thank you for this lecture, and especially for mentioning this fact that the history is actually goes beyond the conventional perceptions. I have the question about the administration, a naive question probably. As to the period you studied, it's quite a broad period, quite a long period. What is Soviet theater in the beginning of the 1920s from the point of view of infrastructure? What important organizational and management changes took place that the national theaters of Russian Empire suddenly became Soviet theaters? On the one hand, these were the same people who used to work in the pre-war period, during the war, in the revolutionary period. They used to work according to the same methods, like traveling theaters and the way the theaters functioned by concession, etc. All of these old practices from the Russian Empire would integrate into the Soviet system.
Yeah, that's
Which
a
way?
huge question. They do have the same practices, right? This idea of renting out theaters, concessions, the buffet, you have to have a tour to make money, but it's new people. This is not true elsewhere. In Soviet Ukraine, it's new people managing the theater. They're just using old practices. And the infrastructure does change in a way you might expect, in that in the early 1920s, the people managing the theater are people who really want to be managing the theater, often decommissioned from the Red Army into positions of managing the arts, because that's what they really want to do. And as you move to the 1930s, you have more like Zdorowie Sili, like you have more hard communist cadres placed as the manager of a theater to really wrangle the actors in order. So someone who might be less inclined to be theatrical is managing a theater, right? Whereas in the 1920s, it really was people who wanted to be there more. So that's definitely a shift. But I think the main thing that happened in terms of infrastructure was that artists finally succeeded in the 1920s in making the state care about them. They've been wanting that through the late 19th century and early 20th century really badly, and they finally got the state to care, and they finally got full state control. There would be consequences to that, but that was the main shift in infrastructure.
Thank you for this interesting story, Mayhill. I would refer to the 1970s as based on your lecture. In 1972, the director of Smerichka ensemble was called to the party meeting, and he was told that out of the 13 members of the company, 9 of them are Jews. That was his favorite story, and he would say, what's the difference? We would all shape the Ukrainian Soviet culture, there is no difference. But that was the new wave of anti-Semitic attitudes related to the immigration of Jews. And my question is, how do you teach this paradox to your American students that Ukrainian culture would be shaped by all of these multi-everything people? And this is part of the borderlands, and this is part of the Soviet culture. On the other hand, borderlands and Soviet culture do not fully explain the situation in the Soviet culture in those times. How do you explain them? I would like to interfere here. How would you recommend to explain this to Ukrainian students?
Welcome.
These pieces of advice would be welcome.
Wow. Actually, it's easy to explain it to American students because we don't have, although certain people in the current political situation would disagree with me, we don't have American culture. I mean, the idea of American culture just doesn't exist. Everyone knows that, you know, your identity is you grew up in Philadelphia, or you went to this school, or your grandmother was Irish, or, you know, it is a melting pot. And so, you know, one can use that to get students to try to understand Soviet culture. It's different, but this idea of multiple levels of belonging, right? That you are a Lvivianin, right? But you also, maybe you work at this particular theater, you're also a Zakivchan, right? You might be Russian or you might be Ukrainian. You have these multiple different kinds of belongings, right, that cannot be just captured in one ethnic category. And I guess my 2 kopiki are what makes culture in Ukraine so amazing is its diversity. Actually, in the 1930s, Soviet Ukraine is the most diverse republic in terms of state-funded institutions. It is the most diverse republic. Right? And I think that's really important. And even after the war, it continues its diversity, right? People from different regions, different ethnicities, different experiences. I mean, that's what makes this, for me, a really interesting place to study, right? And so I guess my 2 kopiki would be to really embrace that, right? And get beyond this category of trying to be restrictive about what is Ukrainian and opening it up, because there's so much in Soviet Ukraine and there's so much in Ukraine.
Дякую. Данило Луцький.
Thank you so much for this lecture on my part as well. I have 2 questions. So your book is supposed to be published in English. Do you want it to be published in Ukrainian? Any plans about that? There might be some plans, we shall see. In any case, as soon as it comes out in English and as soon as it comes to Lviv, I believe the center will announce this. should you be interested in the infrastructure? I'm more interested in the methodology. It's not really about the topic of this lecture, but I'm rather interested where would the historian end and the theater researcher start. I mean, whether these categories would interfere with one another, and also whether they would be badly needed and should be taken into account, otherwise that would lead to some erroneous conclusions. That's a huge issue for me, because the literary researcher getting to the historical entity would not be able to find understanding. Sometimes it's very important to be able to connect these different disciplines. We might get deep into some field methodology, but also it's important to be able to have this interdisciplinary approach.
Terrific question. So what's interesting is that in other, say, studies of other regions, it's not weird to be a historian who works on theater. There's a lot of great historians of France who write about French theater. There's a lot of great historians of Britain who write about British theater. There's some historians of Japan who write about Japanese theater. No one questions them, why are you writing about theater? You must not be serious. That is true, however, with people who work on Russia and Eastern Europe. People often ask me, well, you can't be a historian because you work on theater, right? You can't be a historian, you must be a theater scholar. Is your PhD in theater or is your PhD in history? And these are, my colleagues in Western universities who ask me this. And I think it comes from this region where Teatroznawstwa and Historia are separate, right? They're separate faculties, they're separate departments, they're separate disciplines, and it's very hard to cross. For myself, I've squared the circle by cultural history, which I did with the students a little bit last week. I was very lucky to go to Princeton and work with Robert Darnton, who is a cultural historian of 18th century France. And I would just recommend you run right out and buy The Great Cat Massacre, because he talks about how to write on culture as a historian, but keeping in mind the culture part. And that makes sense. I think the important difference is what questions you ask. So I'm really not actually interested in why things look the way they do on stage. I'm really not interested in, say, discourse analysis. I'm really interested in people's lives. I'm really interested in the lives of artists. I guess one way to put it is I'm really interested in what they talked about in the dressing room when they were putting on their makeup, and less interested in what they did when they got out on the stage. And some of this is because we're maybe all narcissists, and I'm interested in myself, right? I was an actor, and so I'm interested in the lives of actors in other places. What was it like to be an actor in Soviet Kharkiv, right? I mean, that's such an interesting question for me. So I think that the questions that a historian asks and the questions that a theatroznawец asks are different. And I think for me, I kind of work between that by using methodologies of cultural history.
Тут є Ірина.
Thank you, at least at last. My first question, you, if I'm not mistaken, mentioned Marc Chagall. I only know about him as a painter. Can you tell something about his role in theater? And second question is about Yiddish theater. Generally speaking, what are its differential specific features besides language? What is different in its style, topics, etc.? And for example, I heard that Kafka was greatly influenced by Yiddish theater in Prague, not local, of course. So maybe you know how Yiddish theater exactly influenced his work, where we may see in his work such influence? Thanks.
Thanks so much. So Marc Chagall actually did a lot of set designs for theater. He hooked up with the troupe of a guy, Alexei Kranovsky, who founded the theater that would become Gassiet, the State Yiddish Theater, with Solomon Mikhoels. And Chagall did some early sets for them before he left for Paris. So I think part of my point is that there isn't a lot of specific features of Yiddish theater, actually, right? And that what might be more important than its Yiddish theater is its theater in small-town Russian Empire, or its theater in Soviet Ukraine, right? Factors that people might point to as being particular to the Yiddish theater, I don't think are. Actually, you see them in other theaters too. Certainly specific plays one can point to. Again, before we get to this sort of homogenization, there are certain kind of standard plays, right, that are part and parcel of the Yiddish theater canon, right? Sholem Aleichem plays, Uriel Acosta by Karl Butzkov. There are certain kind of vaudevilles that are sort of part of the standard repertory that audiences know, that audiences love, that audiences expect, right? The same way that in Ukrainian-language theater, you have the Teatr Karafeyev, Kropivnitsky, Sadovsky, Zankovecka, right? And the plays that they're doing, right, are expected by their audiences as well. So I think we can talk about plays, and sort of audience expectations. But I think in terms of specific style or manners or kinds of acting or stage practices, management practices, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say it was specific in one ethnic theater, yeah.
I'm not even sure how to get to this question because my comment is quite broad. I believe the peculiarity of the theater you were telling about includes another important dimension. It's a post-revolutionary theater of equal opportunities and equal access. This story started not in 1917, not even in 1905, but it is the consequence of important social movements who wanted to introduce literacy into the wide masses and also introduce culture to make this culture egalitarian, to make the egalitarian society. In that respect, I believe it is important to say that the stages that you mentioned actually had the artists who were illiterate in the first generation. The same concerns the audiences. The artists playing on these stages were coming from small towns or villages, and the audience would also come from little towns and villages. There was a lot of social mobility and open opportunities. They had an impression that they were shaping new culture and new human being. In the 1930s, the model and the pattern was different that in turned out in the late 1930s. There was the huge open field for experiment and pluralism of opinions, plurality of opinions. I believe it was the time when all of these micro communities closed from each other opened up and also opened up to each other and to everyone else. That was the period of large-scale egalization of society, which is typical of the 1930s in general. So you are talking about the backstage of the poor theater in the poor post-war society. You are telling about the mass of different people and the messy situation backstage. You claim that they spoke different languages and they were trying to develop the new identities. That concerns both the backstage and the on-stage settings. For me, it is also an important dimension and domain to remember about the social significance of this theater. They wanted to be socially significant and they managed to be so. But another point that could be mentioned about declarations of the authorities that actually were double standard. They were not fully implemented and fulfilled. Some were in the 1929-1930. Leonid Skripnik would publish his novel, Intelligent Person, where he shows this film novel, cinema novel, how a young person from intelligentsia would be played by the actor who would play his father, and his beloved lady would be played by the same person who was playing his mother. And Skripnik is trying to claim that nothing had changed, that this intelligentsia would actually replicate the same previous models. I believe he would anticipate this crucial change of the social structure, and this imperial model would come back through the Russian language including. Can you say anything about that?
Basically, yes, I agree with you entirely. Yes, that is the point. Thank you for saying it. Yes, exactly. What is going on, Zalashtunkomi is exactly what's going on in the audience, and absolutely this is a moment of new possibilities for people to be in those audiences and to be on the stage, right? It is this incredible moment of social mobility and odd egalitarianism and re-hierarchization. Again, particularly in Soviet Ukraine, where you really don't have, in Moscow, for example, there's so many pre-revolutionary elites who stay on working and in Moscow, and you don't in Soviet Ukraine. So there is this incredible, heightened moment of these new people. I think you're absolutely right. I think that Lenin Skripnik is wrong. I mean, I think that a lot changed. I think that the entire world of cultural and political elites in early Soviet Ukraine are new people. I think their lives were completely changed by revolution and civil war. Is the imperial model back? Yes and no, right? I mean, yes and no. I would say the Soviet Union is an empire. An empire is always difficult for its constituent peoples. But I do think it's a different empire than the Russian Empire. I think the state was much more present in people's lives, actually, than in the Russian Empire. So I think those were different imperial experiences. And I think that, was it coming back through Russian? I don't think that's quite it. I don't think that's quite it. I think that the culture, the particular culture that this group of people had worked for in the 1920s didn't work out. And it didn't work out not because of a dominance of Russian language, but because of a lot of other structural factors in the Soviet system. And yeah, that's what I would say about that. I would say that that Russian language becomes more prevalent isn't the problem. It's that Moscow acquires more central power and the state becomes harder is the problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Так, мені дуже приємно.
It is a pleasure for me to learn that you learned Yiddish. It is a rare case that somebody studies Yiddish. You might know that we have in the archives thousands of plays recorded that were not used and nobody actually needs them. You didn't mention anything about the fact that there are only 2 theaters in Europe, one of them in Warsaw and another one in Bucharest. And there is also the theater in Strasbourg of 1 actor. I would like to say that I remember the times I was a little kid and I made friends with the kids that their parents were actors and artists. They were so poor as church mouse. I remember before the play, they would call 7 times. Maybe somebody would come and buy a ticket. They would actually, these artists were hired by the community and they put them on the cart and send them to another place, to the town. I would like to say that I visited Bucharest for the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the father of Jewish theater. 2 theaters from Ukraine came, Kyiv Theater and Lviv Theater. What kind of theaters were these? You probably know that in Kyiv there was an attempt to make a Jewish theater, and the Institute of Arts established the special department, and they were teaching Yiddish to students. Well, they studied for 5 years and they graduated, and they actually played Ursula Strampoller. But none of them could find employment. Some of them left acting, but others went to act in Russian or Ukrainian theaters. In Lviv, we had this Gimpel theater, which was well known during the Polish state. They were building their theater building. During the war, many actors came here from Poland, in fact, and this is how this intelligentsia developed. There was this Katsiza, he was the conductor of the orchestra and the director. In 1941, what would you think? When he and his wife and his daughter, they evacuated, he was killed next to Ternopil by the nationalists. He was a very decent person. He wrote many things, and he would broadcast on the radio here. There was, there was this Hebrew week or Yiddish week, and also he did many things. But what I would like to say is that we have the festivals of Jewish songs, and the actors from the USA, from Germany would come, and I would ask them, do you know Yiddish? Do you speak Yiddish? But they would sing in Yiddish. They say, I don't speak Yiddish. One of them would claim, my grandmother used to teach me some words. I believe this is the disaster. As to the Jewish theater, we had the theater in 3 buildings. There was this Dina Zlataya, the prima donna, also Sevilla Pastor, and also the 3rd actress in the restaurant. People would take tea and they would perform there. This is how they would make their living. In Lviv, there was Rufina, the major actress, who was left unemployed, and she went to Transcarpathia to perform in the Russian theater. Her son, Ampel, the people's artist of the USSR, he would perform in Moscow in the Bolshoi Theater, and then he took his mother and they immigrated to Israel. I used to know many actors, many artists, Stolkis, Bernstein from the Yiddish theater. They were left without a penny, and I know very well when the Chernovtsi theater was shut down, the Chebonenko person would come. He would be the representative of this cultural sphere, whatever. And he said, you don't pay, we don't need these theaters. And the chief director would say, we used to study together with you on the same course. How could you say this? But he had to do what the party commanded to him. This director, he went to Moscow and he established the Roma Theater. And this Roma Theater is still performing. Today, they have their premises, they have their artists, they have their school. While in Moscow, there is the Jewish theater, Shalom Theater, directed by my friend, and they would perform in Russian. They would sing and dance. They don't have any plays staged. And the last thing I would like to say, that recently we've had a film about a Lviv actor who went later to the USA and to Germany. Granach is his name. Have you heard of him? I also playing the role of Granach, performing the role of Granach in the play. Thank you for your comments, as usual, and thank you for coming to every lecture, not here, but generally attending every event. And we wish to all of you to be proactive, attending different events and sharing the experiences, not only about the information, but also about the ideas how to manage information and how to think about this information. Thank you for this incredible lecture to Professor Mayhill Fowler, and welcome the day after tomorrow, on Thursday, to the presentation of Danilo Ilitsky and Viktor Martinyuk about the map of literary Lviv +/- 1939.